Good day, everybody, and welcome back to the IT 101 sessions with the National Association of State Technology Directors, NASTD. My name is Brad Steele, and I am the Director of Unified Communications for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and I'm a past president of NASTD. While I was president a few years ago, I was reading through the NASTD Constitution and guidelines, and one thing in particular stood out to me. Article 1 of the NASTD Constitution, Section 2, under purposes and goals, the second goal listed is to engage in programs for the training, education, and development of technology professionals from all areas of state government. Along these lines, I started thinking about how we could further that education. We do a lot of networking, and we do a lot of education through presentations and things like that of vendors at our sessions that we have. But I was thinking something that could be a little more pure education. And so I started looking at it and decided to put together a set of educational videos, these 101 sessions that I call them, to help with this education. And what I decided to do is ask some industry leaders some standard questions about a new or a growing technology, something that we maybe are a little confused about or don't really know all of the ins and out about, those keywords that we hear all the time, buzzwords, so to speak, kind of get some depth and some education on it, some basics, so that when we're having those conversations in the future, we can be better educated. If you haven't seen the videos we put together, you can find them on the NASTD website, nastd.org. We've reached out to our corporate affiliates looking for guidance on topics of interest, and I'm very happy to be receiving a lot of insight and ideas, but I still welcome any new ideas if folks have them. So please reach out to me at brad.steele@mass.gov if you've got a session idea for us. So this session is something that is not new, and yet it really is. So I was watching a movie about a week or so ago, and I saw the typical old scene, and it was a kind of a black and white movie, and the person came up to the door and was knocking on the door, and the guy comes over to the door inside, and he slides across the bar, undoes the chain, throws the deadbolt, then turns the other key, and then turns the doorknob, and then pulls it open, and only to find out that there was another bar at the bottom that he had to then pop open and get the door open. And I was like, multi-factor authentication. And while that's probably not exactly what we're talking about, I mean, it's not a new idea, right? How secure are you? If you have one lock, you're not as secure as if you have two, or in this case, 10. And then as I was watching some other things over the holiday season, I saw a couple of other movies where, more modern movies, and it's the guy has to get into the vault and he has to have his thumb on a phone while he's voice recognition and looking at his eyeball and his speech pattern and everything. And I was like, well, that's definitely multi-factor authentication. So the question is, how does all that work? So that is our topic for this session, multi-factor authentication, and our corporate partner for the discussion is Yubico. This topic is so important and so relevant that we needed two subject matter experts, so we brought in a couple of folks to help us out. First, we have Jeff Frederick, the manager of public sector and solutions engineering at Yubico. Jeff has been building complex identity management solutions for public sector customers for 25 years. He currently leads Yubico's public sector solutions engineering team in securing customers' IT systems with strong authentication. And he enjoys relaxing with his wife and 5 retired greyhounds in his off time. And I'm jealous of his greyhounds, because they are retired. Our second subject matter expert that we have is Jeremy Grant. He is a managing director in the cybersecurity practice at Venable LLP. And he has worked for more than 20 years at the intersection of cybersecurity and identity, including a stint at the senior executive advisor for identity management at NIST. In his free time, man after my own heart, he enjoys watching vintage Star Trek with his kids and scheming to find ways to get his family out of the house so he can play his drum kit and turn his electric guitar up to 11. Yes, I can empathize with that too. So gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So, I'm going to start the conversation. And again, I gave my horrible explanation of deadbolts and eyeballs and stuff like that. But tell me, what really is multi-factor authentication? What is MFA?
Well, I think up front, you need to understand how to pronounce it, and that it may depend on where you are. So in the US, it's MFA. But if you're north of the border in Canada, they call it MFA. Sorry. Figured I had to follow up with something.
You had to try, Jeremy.
I got to write that one down.
I actually got that from John Bradley, who's a Canadian at Yubico. So he should get credit for that. So actually, I think the door lock analogy is a really good one, and I've used it in the past. And that there's a lot of different kinds of locks, and when you look at look, I've got a regular lock and a deadbolt to my front door. The lock I use in my bathroom to try and keep my kids out is a lot weaker. And I think when you think about locks for authentication factors in the online world, look, we've been using passwords for years. And I think there was a time when, a long, complex password might have been the equivalent of a deadbolt. But the problem is the attackers have gotten so sophisticated at, phishing and otherwise compromising even really complex passwords that these days they're only about as good as that flimsy lock that you can, pick with a paperclip or a quarter, depending on how it's, set up. And so what MFA is at a high level is a way to augment that first factor with a second factor of authentication, so that you have, as the name would suggest, multiple factors. It's commonly just two. So some people will say 2FA or MFA. That's basically the same thing. You could have 3 or 4, though many people don't do that. And depending on what kind of authentication you're using, that can be a little redundant. It basically gets, thrown into 3 categories. Something which is generally a password or, could be a PIN code. Something you have, which could be a certificate, directly on your phone, or it could be a separate token that you're going to carry, much like the YubiKey that I use, in my everyday life. But, something that's possession-based, it's often used there to prove possession of a cryptographic key, or something you are, which is a biometric. So using, your fingerprint or your face or your iris to authenticate. And MFA is, at a high level, a way to combine any 2 of those 3 factors into, more sophisticated and stronger authentication.
All right. So is all MFA the same? Are there differences? Are there different types of MFA? And what are the differences in like security and usability and things like that?
So I'll say there's a lot of different types. And I think one of the challenges we have with all the different types is it's created a lot of confusion. Dating back to my time at NIST, we were at a point where we were just trying to urge people to use any MFA. And, the predominant, form at the time might have been, the one-time passcode tokens that you might have, dealt with in the enterprise space. Or we were really excited when, I guess it was around 2012, Google rolled out their free app, Google Authenticator, which would give you a one-time passcode, directly in your phone. And, that was exciting too, in that it was a way to make it more easily available. I think the problem we're seeing these days with MFA is, one, on the security side, the attackers have caught up. And so much as, they know how to compromise a complex password, anything that's based on a shared secret is a second factor. That one-time passcode that's blinking for 30 seconds, well, if you're being spearphished, 30 seconds is plenty of time for them to take that code and copy it over and, paste it into, a different app that they're actually using while they're phishing you. To the point, there's now bots that will automate all of this. So we're seeing, I think, differences in security where there's, MFA tools that can really stand up against those attacks and those that can't. But the other thing I think that's really important is usability, in that one of the challenges I think the security industry's had over the years is that they have built MFA tools that were basically designed by security weenies, of which I consider myself one. So I've never really had a problem with them. But when you start to think about the user experience, what do people hate more than anything else? Well, they really hate entering passwords and they forget them a lot. And then if you ask them to take out a token and look for a second password or look for that on their smartphone or, take a code that's texted to them. I mean, what's worse than one password? Well, two. And so we've continually come up with user experiences, I'd say with at least the first generation of MFA technologies, that took an awful login experience with the password and made it worse. And shockingly, people didn't really want to use those and did everything they could to avoid doing it, came up with ways to get around them. Yep. And so I think these days we're now starting to see the emergence of, what I would call next generation MFA. We'll talk a lot about the FIDO standards today and the way that they play a role there, that offer not only much better security that can stand up against some of these phishing attacks, but also are a heck of a lot easier to use to the point where we can start to get to post-password experiences.
And to that point, my mother, who's 75 years old, would never use MFA because it was just too difficult. It was not something she could really wrap her head around. With these new technologies, specifically the FIDO that Jeremy is talking about, I've given her a FIDO security key, and now she uses it for everything. And she feels more secure and feels like it's easy enough to use that she can use it for every place that will accept it.
That's awesome. So is that you talking about FIDO and those things? So is that phishing resistant MFA? Is that what that is? Or what is phishing resistant MFA? So
I'd say at a high level, it's MFA that can't be phished. So I meant, here's, let's sort of run through different, things that are out there. So, one-time passcodes have been the predominant form in the consumer and enterprise space that we've seen. And as I mentioned, the idea of this code that was only good for 30 seconds was a genius idea until the attackers figured out if they could convince you to enter your 12-character password, they could convince you to hand over that code as well. I think the other thing that, and by the way, it doesn't matter if that's generated on a secure token or in an app, or if it's texted to you, they can capture it and then you're locked out. This is what happened, I think, most famously to John Podesta back during the 2016 presidential campaign. People recall he was Hillary Clinton's campaign chairperson. And a lot of people, after his Gmail was hacked and, the contents of it were, shared everywhere. Well, didn't they have 2FA? Well, the, behind the scenes answer was he did, but it was a one-time passcode. And so that was phished. And, the rest is quite literally history in terms of how it, may have impacted the campaigns. But I think what you're seeing now is it's become much easier to do all that. We've also seen the emergence of technologies that use push notifications as a way to make the user experience simpler. And I think the issue there is we're starting to see some of those get phished as well. Again, if you're being spear phished, so Brad, type in your password, great. And then they, if they're typing your password into the real site and you're typing it into a phishing site, well, it's going to trigger the automatic push notification on the real site, which will then show up on your phone. And you'll go, oh, yeah, sure, of course I'm trying to log in. Here's the second factor. And you push a button and you very conveniently assisted the attacker with an account takeover. They didn't even need to get that one-time passcode. So I think where FIDO's different is it leverages asymmetric public key cryptography, where there's nothing to phish, in that there is no shared secret where I know this 6-digit code and you know it as well. Instead, it's leveraging public-private key pairs. Essentially, it's a lightweight form of PKI where I have only the private key and it's stored, say on my security key, or it can be stored in my device, depending on how we're, doing the login. And the public key's on the other side. And so what I really need to do is have possession of this private key to sign a cryptographic challenge. Well, the phisher is not going to know the public key. And so that's really where you get to something that's phishing resistant. CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency within DHS, just updated their guidance on MFA. They called FIDO the gold standard of MFA, particularly for that reason, that it stands up where a lot of other MFA can now be compromised.
Okay. What role do security keys play in this? You mentioned it briefly there, but can you elaborate more?
Jeff, you want to take that one first and I'll build on that?
Yeah, I mean, the security key is the way to store these private keys securely and provide some portability. So like Jeremy said, you could store your private key on your phone, and that's a perfectly reasonable solution. But you really want to separate, in my mind, you want to separate the credential, i.e. the stuff on the security key, from the machine that you're authenticating to. If that machine gets compromised, you don't want to have any access to those private keys. So, obviously where you would go and we build security keys, but we think that is the most secure way to do this. And it gives portability. I can take that key and use it in system A at my desk if I happen to have to log into a server in a data center, I can walk up to that server, log in with that key, because it's it's not tied to my machine. I can limit the number of credentials I need to manage across multiple service devices and services.
Yeah, and I'll say, just to add to that, I mean, what securities keys offer, I mean, there's really two key ways to deploy FIDO. The first, as I mentioned, is having to be embedded in the device, and I think for a lot of consumer applications, you'll want to have those private keys, one for every service you're dealing with that needs MFA, embedded in your smartphone, embedded in your laptop. Although it still presents issues when you change devices, because I think the model that we've seen in a lot of places is you can use your key to basically bootstrap a new device from an old one. And so if I'm using this key I was mentioning before we signed in, I just got a new laptop for work. A lot of the services that I protect with FIDO, as I've been going into them over the last couple of weeks, prompted to basically insert my security key for the first time, which then is used as a way to register my device as a trusted device. And so I've got stronger authentication there. But there's a lot of compelling use cases as well in terms of having it built right into your device. I think in the enterprise space, where we're really seeing a lot of increased adoption for security keys in both government and industry, is the fact that people aren't on just one device, or you might have shared devices. So, in law enforcement, for example, I might be, checking out a different mobile device every day, or it might be tied to, my police car or something. There's different people using it. Well, the key is a great portable authenticator that allows you to log in. Likewise, if I've got a laptop and a mobile device or two, this is one authenticator you can have that can work with all three of them. Either by inserting the key into a USB port, or tapping it to transact over USB, over NFC. And so I think the security key has really emerged as, it's almost like a Swiss Army knife of authenticators, in that it supports a lot of different ways to authenticate. And that's been really beneficial for a lot of enterprises to simplify. You have one solution instead of one for every device.
And we've worked with a number of customers who have been able to decrease the number of computing devices they need to purchase. They've got an iPad that multiple shifts use for something. Well, they used to have to buy one iPad per person. Now they can use one iPad for 3 shifts, because they store those credentials and their authentication information and identities on the security keys.
Awesome. So what is the difference between MFA using symmetric versus asymmetric cryptography?
I think the simple, answer is, it's a question of, are you using shared secrets or something that is not a shared secret? So again, the one-time symmetric. How do I break this down? Getting into discussions of asymmetric public key cryptography can get really nerdy and confusing really quick. But what I would say is this: a symmetric key is a shared key. And so if the idea is that I know the same thing that you know, and I have to pass that somehow over a channel, at some point that creates a lot of opportunities for there to be a man in the middle, who, whether it's they're phishing it or somehow intruding on the session. There's a lot of different ways that key can be compromised. And we see this year over year. Things that are based on symmetric authentication get compromised to the extent that 75 or 80% of breaches most years can be traced to some sort of symmetric authenticator being compromised. With asymmetric public key cryptography, again, I've only got the private key, and I register a corresponding public key at the service I'm trying to log into. So if that's the state of Massachusetts, there is nothing to steal if I say break into the mass authentication database. You're not going to see breaches of millions of passwords were compromised in a breach, and now you're advising everybody to go take steps to remediate it. Because if you steal a bunch of public keys, well, so what? They're useless. You just have people re-register a new key pair next time they log in. And so I think it's that separation of authentication factors into that public and private element that essentially eliminates any scalable attack. I can't go steal 5 million passwords from you. If I want to get into your account, now I actually have to get this device from you, or your mobile device from you if the keys are there. And not to say anything's unhackable. Nothing's unhackable, given enough resources. But it starts to change the economics of attacks and allows you to get, this may be the most important point actually, is the economics of credential-based attacks that use symmetric authentication like passwords or legacy, MFA like one-time passwords it's really cheap to launch attacks. And so you just see, these days automated bots launching millions of them each day, and you have a 1% success rate. That's still a pretty good day at the office for an attacker. If you can get people to use asymmetric authenticators, you eliminate those attacks. You totally change the economics. So now in order to get to an account, you have to launch a highly targeted attack that's going to compromise somebody's device that they have in their possession. And, you know, I don't want to start incenting attackers to kidnap people and steal their devices, but it's a very different equation compared to, you know, sitting off in Russia or, you know, somewhere else in the world where there's, you know, organized criminal gangs doing this. And, you know, they can just launch these attacks, you know, with impunity from far away because it's easy.
And automated at that, right? So
Yeah.
It's not really taking any time other than the keystroke to start the process, right? So you mentioned a couple of things here. So what are the major changes in technology that have occurred? I noticed you mentioned FIDO earlier. Can you go into that a little bit more and what problems it addresses?
Well, I think the biggest issue, and Jeff, I want to, you know, get your perspectives too, is that FIDO, I mean, one, it's a standard. And so I think I've sort of explained technically how using asymmetric public key cryptography, you know, helps on the security side. But I think what's really fascinating about FIDO is the massive embrace you've seen by literally everybody that matters. And by that, I mean, you can't buy an Apple device or a device running Android or Chrome or a device running Windows these days that does not come with support for FIDO built in, without support for FIDO built in. Every browser supports it. Every operating system supports it. In some ways, you can use the devices themselves as an authenticator, or if you choose to use something like a YubiKey security key, it just works automatically. And that standard support that's built in, you know, I came out of the smart card and PKI world 20 years ago, where if we wanted to help a client, well, use smart cards, it'd be weeks of trying to figure out like what kind of middleware are we going to get in and how do we generate certificates on each card. And like there was a whole bunch of stuff you had to bolt on. And now the support's all built in. And so I think the fact that, you know, whether it's the platform operators, the big cloud providers, big providers in banking and payments and fintech and healthcare, and frankly, in government now, I mentioned the CISA guidance on, you know, MFA, where they called FIDO the gold standard. You're also seeing governments across the globe start to build support for FIDO authentication into public services. You now have this tool where you know, everybody has something on the device they're already using that they can use to enable passwordless authentication, to enable strong MFA. And that's just a real game changer because it's built in and not bolted on.
And I think Jeremy hit it. The standardization is the key because, you know, any new application that comes out knows it can follow the standard and they're not going to break anything. You know, if you get a new laptop, you don't have to worry about, well, does it have the capabilities to do what I already use? No, it's already built into all these pieces, which reduces the cost of vendors to build strong MFA for everything. You know, instead of you having to hope that whatever your MFA you want to use, it's Google Authenticator or RSA token, does it work with this thing that I just bought? Boom, we know it's a FIDO, it's a standard, and it works.
Excellent. So I can remember my first computer that I installed over at the stadium back in 1994. And the first thing it asked me to do was put in a password. I can remember to this day what that password was. It was a 286 AT computer, believe it or not. Giant thing with a 5 1/4 floppy in the front of it, and it was asking for a password. Here we are in 2021. Is there really such thing as passwordless security?
Yeah, absolutely. But Jeff, why don't you take this one first? I've been talking a lot.
Yes, and it's there. It's now really up to all the back-end pieces to enable it. So I have a personal Office 365 account. I have removed my password. I can't use a password anymore. I have to use a security key. So absolutely it's there. And one of the things I want to point out is most people ask me, well, how do I protect, if this thing is passwordless, how do I actually protect it? And the FIDO standard has the concept of a PIN, which is very important to understand. So a PIN and a password are completely different. Passwords are sent across the wire to the backend you're logging into, vulnerable for exposure. A PIN only is accessed by the local device. So when I plug in my security key and I type in that PIN, it doesn't go across the wire across the internet. It goes from my keyboard down into my YubiKey hanging off of my USB port, and it's specifically only on that device. So it's much less vulnerable to hacking or vulnerable or compromise, which means those pins can be short. The standard in the U.S. government PIV world is 6 characters, 8 characters. So how can I remember an 8-character number versus a 27-character password? Absolutely. So that is the first phase one, is these standards are now out there and they work. Now it's up to all the back-end pieces to now support these standards. And again, we've started down the road with Microsoft and Office 365. I think the rest of these solutions and industry standards will start to take on this passwordless option.
And I think, oh, go ahead.
Just going to say, what Jeff reminded me, I left out a really important part of what FIDO is, which so it's rooted in asymmetric public key cryptography, and that's great from the security side. But from the usability side, why it's considered MFA is it's paired with something else. It's a second factor. So, there's ways I can use my security key with the password just as a standalone second factor. There's also security keys that have a biometric built in that I can have total passwordless, where I can just log in, say, to my Windows machine, going in, matching my fingerprint, and then you are, doing an on-device match of a biometric, or it could be a PIN in some cases, that then opens up that cryptographic key. On my iPhone, I can use, in this case, it'd be Face ID, which would be the user verification step, again, matched securely in, protected hardware in this, and that then unlocks the key. And when we start talking about passwordless, I think this is where things are now widely available. In fact, I think Gartner, who's long been skeptical of it, just put out a brief a couple of weeks ago that said this is actually going to be the year of passwordless, because the standards are there, largely because of FIDO, where, whether it's a security key where I'm, matching a biometric, or security key that I'm logging in with a PIN, or things that are, with, what people call integrated platform authenticators, where it's the biometric on device. By the way, with Windows, it could be Windows Hello. That's what they built around the FIDO standards, where you truly have passwordless authentication. And so, sometimes people ask, well, if there isn't a password, is it really MFA? Absolutely. And it's probably a much better user experience. I mean, I'd much rather match a fingerprint or face, from that perspective, than try to type in, I think I've got a 14-character password here right now in my office. That's, we got some work to do there.
Well, if you can get the facial ID to work when you're wearing your COVID-19 mask, I'm in.
Yeah. Which, by the way, is where it's good to have a backup like a PIN. That I think, there's been some work done in FIDO on biometric certification. A 6-digit PIN is roughly equivalent to the security you get from a consumer level biometric sensor in a smartphone that you get these days. And so, it can be, multiple paths in order to log in, but the whole idea is it's that first user verification matched on the device, and that then unlocks the cryptographic key, which, does the really secure heavy lifting behind the scenes.
Awesome. All right, so moving away from kind of the direct questions into some of the more planning and process questions. So what should we be asking our new services and application owners when we build MFA?
So what do they support natively already? Do they have a capability in the system? And then look at that risk and figure out, is it good enough? Because, bottom line, based on the CISA memo from today, FIDO is where you should be moving towards, or phishing resistant, but FIDO is the most efficient and the easiest to implement, because it is a standard. So, hey, what do you support today? And is that strong enough? And if it's not, then you need to do something else, whether that's build your own MFA front end, use a commercial service like an Okta or a Duo potentially that does the strong MFA, integrate with an Azure AD if that's what you're using. I can't stress enough, MFA should be the second thing you ask any app vendor or any solution you're looking at. First, what does your solution you're providing do for me? Secondly, what's your MFA solution? And if it's not a strong phishing resistant MFA solution, you need to figure out what to do.
Excellent. So you kind of touched on this a little bit, but so can MFA be an on-premise solution, or is it strictly in the cloud, or can it be a combination of both?
All of the above. So how you do MFA is you're going to do MFA many different ways. And by that, you're going to have some applications, maybe an on-premise application that you build that does MFA in and of itself. So there's easily consumable libraries. If your state agency does its own app development, there's easily consumable and available libraries that will allow strong authentication out of the bat, some FIDO, multiple FIDO libraries out there. If you already have a cloud service that you're using for other things, it may provide strong authentication already. And those integration points, a SAML or a WS Federation, are very easy to implement. A lot of software as a service, Salesforce, for example, provides MFA out of the box. And so you're going to do it all. I think that the most important part of this is one hardware token to do it all. So that's the beauty of FIDO is you register your hardware token with multiple services, but that end user only has one token and one PIN to remember. But he uses it with every service, on-prem, cloud, self-service, whatever. And I actually use my own FIDO token for my global entry account with the US government. I use it for my social security account. I use it for my bank. I use it for my Yubico stuff. So I use that one single FIDO token across all of my services for everything, personal and business and consumer.
Yeah, and I think one point I'd make on that is, it can be used whether it's cloud or on-prem. One of the benefits of FIDO, as I mentioned before, it's standards are great. Standards that are universally supported with every operating system, with every big cloud service. That's where you really start to get some bang for your buck. And I think I've been talking about this for a few years. If you've been seeing more and more of the big, stakeholders in tech sort of come together around FIDO, this idea of what I've called the inevitability of FIDO, which as it's built into more devices and built into more cloud services, in 2022, it's really hard to go find a cloud service that isn't going to support this. And so, this idea of just investing in, say one, security key solution, you might still have some legacy things that are on-prem that you're going to have to figure out a way how to use it, but it should be supported everywhere. And it's a pretty simple, deployment. I talk a lot about the idea of deployment friction. What kind of burden does this put on, the folks who are running IT in the back end to get it deployed and integrated and supported with all the users? I think your deployment friction with FIDO is going to be a lot less than, some other tools that are out there for authentication.
And Jeremy made a comment earlier about the old smart card days where you'd had to figure out what piece to use here and what piece to use there. Because FIDO is a standard and universally supported, I can use Edge browser. Jeremy can use Chrome. You can use Firefox. Doesn't matter. You don't have to install anything, whether it's business related or personal related. You don't have to install anything. It just that those capabilities are built into the operating systems and the browsers, which is the interface on the user side. Heck of a lot less management interface or overhead for your IT staff to support FIDO.
Awesome. So what if I have legacy applications that only support OTP? Do I have to do something different? What do I need to consider there?
Yes, I think you do need to be very cognizant of those. You do have authentication proxies that are available. So, back in the old days, you had SiteMinder and some of these other ones. You have Duo and Okta. You might even be able to tie these things into your Active Directory or Azure AD. But you want to have that secure front end that does the MFA and validates that individual and that user. Then you can use a standard method like a SAML or WS Federation to pass information over to those apps. And I'm an old identity management guy. I've been doing it for many, many years. When this discipline first came out, we used to talk about applications won't have user data anymore. They're just going to take an assertion from, say, a SAML token that says, this person has access to this section of your system. So you don't care anymore. I think we can actually get to that goal eventually after 30 years with a FIDO solution where apps don't do identity management in and of themselves anymore. It's all predicated on a central directory and FIDO authentication into that application.
One thing I'll say, and I guess I'll say it since Jeff didn't, but because this is kind of unique to YubiKey products as opposed to other security keys, is most of them support MFA, support OTP as well. And so it's, in fact, I mean, the Most of the models you can, leverage what's on it to support. If you want to do a PIV smart card on a YubiKey, you can do it. You can do an OTP, and you can support FIDO. And so I'll say, I've stopped using it, but a couple of years ago, as I was using my one key for different things, I had about a half dozen cloud services I was authenticating with FIDO, but I had an old password manager that only supported OTP as a second factor. I could use the same YubiKey with that. Not all security key vendors have that multi-protocol functionality, but there are solutions that are out there where if you got a couple old clunky legacy things and you're just not going to bring them into something more modern, but they do support OTP, you can use your key there.
Excellent. So now those things that get real critical to states in particular, how do we pay for MFA? What are the cost models? How much does it cost? What's this going to cost me?
So I think there's a number of different components. There's the identity provider, that back-end thing you authenticate to. Azure AD, let's just throw that out there. We see a lot of that in state and local government is Azure AD. Well, that has FIDO capability today. So if you're already purchased or if you're already paying for Azure, you most probably have what you need. I don't know the latest Microsoft pricing models, but in general, I think they all include FIDO today. So you don't need to pay for your backend identity provider. Now you need some kind of a FIDO authenticator. You can purchase, and I'll use our product for an example. You can purchase our products, single cost, good for as long as it works. I've got a 10-year-old YubiKey, it still works. So these things do last. So you pay for those products on a one-time purchase, perpetual license, works as long as you need. We do have a subscription model. For example, you can purchase things in a subscription. You could get updates. It's in large enterprises, it's easier to manage turnover, employee turnover on a subscription model. So, our list price of keys is $45 up. When you start buying in quantity, those prices always also come down. But that's a one-time cost, for example. So generally, you need to get some kind of hardware token. And if you don't have an identity provider backend for FIDO authentication, you need to procure those. Generally, those are per user licenses. If you're using a SaaS app and it already has the capability to support FIDO, again, no additional cost. So, depending on the size of the organization, we've worked with very large cities, and yes, they get into multiple millions of dollars of cost, but we're talking 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 end users versus a smaller city that might be 1,000 or 2,000. So I think the costs are reasonable. I'll let Jeremy speak to some of the other things he's seeing out in the industry as well.
Well, I think that there's part of it's the cost of the key if you go with a security key model, and then part of it's what's the broader IAM solution that you're using, and is FIDO included with the base level, or they want you to pay more for it. And I think that's going to vary depending on the vendors you talk to. And in fact, that's a great question to ask them if you're considering an IAM investment is, what is your support for FIDO, and do I have to pay extra for it, and push them, not to. I think there's the other model, which is you can use embedded authenticators that are built into smartphones, that are built into laptops. Not to harp too much on Microsoft. I mentioned before, Windows Hello is built around the FIDO standards, and so there are models that may involve of a security key centric model, a built-in authenticator model, or honestly a hybrid model is probably going to be appropriate, I think, for a lot of state enterprises where does everybody need a key? You might need to do an assessment of some of the use cases and figure out the most affordable way to go forward. But so I think there's a lot of different. One of the things I like about FIDO is it really is it's a standard, but there's a lot of different ways that you can deploy it. And so, the way that it appears to the user in 4 different applications might seem a little bit different. It's that it's all rooted in this standard asymmetric public key cryptography behind the scenes that kind of makes it so powerful. But I've seen a lot of different vendors come out and come up with different ways to integrate FIDO to support different user experiences. And with that, you're going to see some different pricing models too.
And another thing to remember is you're going to most probably reduce your support costs. So Google did a research study back in 2018. They implemented YubiKeys and the original FIDO protocol, the FIDO U2 protocol, and they noticed a 92% reduction in support costs. Their account lockouts and password resets went away because they were using security keys. So while it may cost you some money to buy a security key for your individuals, you will probably save more than that in just help desk costs and lost productivity alone. So, there's the whole TCO model to think about. I think, if you want to come talk to us at Yubico, we have some good models we've run against that for different size organizations that we can show you. But I think in general, you will either break even or save money if you go to a standard like FIDO.
And if you avoid a breach, you've saved.
There is that element as well that needs to be looked at. But no, I mean, the Google study was interesting in that their help desk costs plummeted because people had problems with OTPs all the time. And once they went to security keys, it wasn't an issue. You can go passwordless. I mean, think about, everybody, I always ask, like, what percentage of your help desk costs calls are for a password reset? And the answer is usually more than 50%. If you can eliminate those, suddenly you can start to reallocate resources to, maybe some more pressing needs. And, by the way, also make all your users happy because you've made the password go away.
Yep. Just so you know, my number one goal, as stated, is not to have my name in the Boston Globe unless I win the lottery.
Yeah, then we'll be knocking on your door.
Yes. So what are the major obstacles that you see when people are trying to put MFA in place?
I think number one is user resistance to change. Anytime they have to do something different, they are always resisted. I go back to the early PIV days, and I was rolling out PIV cards for government agencies. The training process alone was painful, and the money we spent on that. So, getting the folks to understand, number one, that this is better. And that's why I think FIDO is so important. To Jeremy's point of passwordless, no more passwords, no more password changes every 90 days, no more strange passwords because you didn't add 3 of these characters and 2 of these characters. You just use this key and type in this PIN that you can remember, and you're good. So we can overcome those pretty quickly. And then it's the confusing infrastructure pieces. I mean, I think FIDO has streamlined a lot of that process. And because it's a standard and supported in browsers, you don't have to worry about all the different pieces and parts and do they all work together. You know that you can enable a FIDO authentication solution. Any browser the user wants to use will work. Any operating system will work. And most, if not all, back-end systems will support this now. So I think those problems, the traditional problems we've seen with MFA have been overcome with the FIDO standard itself.
The only other thing I've seen, and this may sound like a stupid obstacle, but particularly when you're dealing with citizen-facing apps, a lot of big retail sites and banks have found there's a significant percentage of customers who it's been drilled into their head so long, year after year, protect your password. Passwords are important. It's got to be long and strong. That if you offer them the ability to eliminate the password, they think something's wrong and they don't trust it. So I think we're going to solve that over time. But, unfortunately, we're still caught up in this. I mean, what's really, now very outdated advice that, this, 16 character abomination with, symbols and numbers and uppercase and lowercase is actually protection. There was a time when I worried about brute force attacks, and sure, it was. Now it's credential stuffing attacks. It's the fact that I'll have that password and reuse it across 18 sites. And so if one's breached, the others are vulnerable. And it's, more often these days, really well-crafted phishing attacks that, again, if 2% of people fall for it, you're still hosed.
All right. Final question. We made it to the end. As a Commonwealth of Massachusetts employee, or for my friends across the country that are going to be listening to this, what else do we need to know?
I would say MFA is a multi-pronged approach. I mean, you're at least for the foreseeable future, you're not going to have one size fits all, because there are applications out there that are 40 years old that are still running in some organizations, and they support 5-digit or 6-digit passwords. How do you solve those problems? So be prepared to do a lot of different things, and ask questions. This is a major undertaking. And it's complicated. It's getting simpler as time goes on. Ask questions. And I would say really consider what you're going to use for your MFA capabilities. There are high quality products and low quality products. Don't skimp on this. This is protecting the keys to the kingdom. And I know the states deal a lot with this, is the cybersecurity insurance. If you choose a poorly constructed MFA solution, it's almost as bad as not having anything at all, because if you get breached, then your cybersecurity insurance may or may not support you. So, make intelligent decisions and think hard, and ask your vendors, talk to them, ask the questions, and pick trustworthy solutions.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add on that is, and I won't disagree with anything Jeff said, some MFA is still better than no MFA, particularly when it comes to, say, the citizen-facing apps, where I think we're at we see this in the federal government. So the White House published a new zero trust strategy from the Office of the Federal CIO a couple months ago, and it's all about phishing-resistant MFA, and it calls out the FIDO web authentication standard by name, mandates it for the enterprise. They point out for consumers, not everybody's going to be able to have a security key right away. Not everybody's some people won't be on old devices where you just can't support that. So you need to make it available to them, but make sure they're using some kind of MFA that will still block, what I call some of the less sophisticated attacks, like credential stuffing, even if it's not going to guard against a phishing attack, but it's something that's better than nothing. And so I think particularly when I look at citizen-facing apps, keep in mind you'll probably need to support a few different types of solutions, in part to meet the customers where they are with the kinds of devices that they're using today. And I think over time that'll become more predominantly FIDO, just because the user experience is going to be so superior, and a lot of those outdated devices will get, mothballed. But something's still better than nothing. So don't take a FIDO or bust approach, particularly when it comes to your public-facing apps.
Excellent. All right, that concludes our session, folks. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you were able to learn something. I know I was. I know that I can go remove all those deadbolts from my back door. I'm going to put in a nice little combo key where I can log in from my Alexa app. And
fingerprint reader. Get to fingerprint reader.
There you go. So again, I'd like to thank Jeff Frederick from Yubico and Jeremy Grant from Venable. Thank you both very much. If you all have any questions about this subject, please reach out to me and I can get you in touch with these two gentlemen. And I think that what I'll do is they sent me the link earlier today to the press release about FIDO. So I will drop that link at the bottom of the video once we're done here, so that folks can log in and see that press release. So thank you all very much, and see you next time.
Thank you.